In this video, I'm going to share some tips and suggestions for how to approach an exam. So this is an example of a junior level undergraduate engineering course on traffic engineering. And so of course it will vary depending on the program and other types of information, but I hope this will provide some general guidance and information about taking an exam and ways to approach the exam itself. Of course, there's going to be some important information on the cover of the exam. So I would highly recommend reading this information and understanding what is expected during the exam. So some of the things noted here clearly state the assumptions, display proper units, and show all work. In particular, this is very important for partial credit, and I'll talk about this in one of the problems extensively about how to set up a problem, how to think through showing the instructor, the professor, the work that you do know and how to approach it, and showing those concise and clear steps of how you worked through something. And then it is great practice to draw a box around your final answer. That way the instructor knows where to look, especially if your work is scattered around a page. It's important that they can find what your final answer is quickly. This was an exam where I did apply an ungrading procedure. So that's what the smiley faces are about. I have a note here about if I ask for 3 things, only provide me 3. I won't grade anything beyond the first 3 that are provided. If I say, list 3 reasons why something, if you give me 4 or 5, I'll stop at the first 3. This is a 100-point exam. Internet access is allowed on this one for completing the exam, but no communication applications are allowed. So looking at some of the problems now, one of the first things that should grab your attention are, hopefully this is provided, the percentages that are associated with each problem. So out of a 100-point exam, this is 5%, means 5% of the points, and therefore it's a reasonable expectation that you should only spend 5% of your time on this problem. So if it's a 1-hour exam, you shouldn't spend more than 5 minutes on this problem, because that likely means you're going to affect your ability to work other problems. So keep that in mind. Don't get caught up and spend, if you only have an hour, 20 minutes on a problem that's worth 5% of your grade. You've got to have an internal clock or some kind of system of do that time management. And you may skip around. It may not make sense. If there's one you're stuck on, in my opinion, you should move forward and find a problem that you can work on, then come back to those that you can't. Another common mistake that I see students make is if there are multiple items being asked on each problem, make sure you underline those or restate those so you don't miss that. For example, this problem 3 asks us both to estimate the number of trips. And so this is one thing. You may actually, just annotate your exam as you go. And then there's an additional part. How many seats would you expect? So there's 2 pieces here, and I would probably go ahead and write this down as 1 and 2. And as you start working, you're probably working on number 1. And then later on, you're working on number 2. And then go ahead and circle or put a box around whatever your answer is. So if you finish that and finish this, and then it'll be clear to the instructor, here's the part for number 1, here's the part for number 2, and also will remind you, if you annotate the question, that you've got another piece, another question that you need to work on. Let's see, let me clear these annotations. And we'll keep going through this. I want to spend more time on this last problem. It is a more difficult problem. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, state assumptions and what you're looking for. So a lot of students will do that at the top of the exam, start writing out what their assumptions are, what their givens, what they're looking for, and that's fine to do. A problem like this, though, and I tend to do this where I do give extra information. So this information is extra and won't be needed for this particular problem, but that's realistic for a real world problem that you're going to have lots of information. You've got to figure out how to apply that information, what to do with it, what's useful, what's not. So one approach is, instead of rewriting everything because you have a limited time, the radius is R. So write that there. Here's your Here's your delta. So however you want to denote that. So you can denote it within the problem, or you can write it separately. Either of those approaches to me generally works well, as long as you've got your process and that's what you're sticking with. For an exam like this, where if you've worked these problems in class, or if you thought about these problems, drawings are extremely helpful. And that's for most of engineering, there's usually a drawing that can be associated. So if I've got a difficult problem, and I'm going to assume it's difficult because it's 20% of the exam. So I should be spending 20% of my time. It's worth 20% of the points. I'm going to work on this problem and make sure it's a priority for completing this, because this is a big amount of those points. So having a drawing is going to be critical, and I'll show an example of a drawing. I'll also put a link to the YouTube video that actually solves this in a more clean fashion. I'll show my solution here as well, but it's not quite as well thought out. And that's part of the trade-offs that you have with writing down your responses on an exam. You can't write everything you want. There's some compromises there. You need to be efficient with your time so you can complete the exam, but also provide enough work and the correct type of work to solve the problem. Another thing here is whether it's open book or open notes versus closed book. I always use the open book, open notes format because I want to encourage the deep thinking versus memorization. And I allow the development of spreadsheets. So to me, all these calculations that can be done in this problem can be done and developed with an Excel spreadsheet, and use that to inform your work. You're still going to need to show those intermediate steps, but the calculation part of it can be done for you. I also think it's something that gets overlooked a lot for open book, open note exams, is not doing enough review, not doing enough exam prep. I still highly recommend doing a summary of your notes. That's going to help organize you, help you diagnose problems, help you locate where that problem may be within your notes. So you shouldn't go in an open notes, open book exam and not have prepared for the exam. There's things you should do, follow. There's a lot of different exam techniques and summarizing your notes and those types of things. So learn how you learn best and apply those strategies on all of your exams. For partial credit, it's important to be organized. Again, the drawing is critical here. And even though this is more of a quantitative type of problem, there's still a lot of qualitative information in here. You still have to know how to apply each of these components to be able to solve the quantitative part. So even within a heavy calculation problem, I'm still looking as a professor, I'm still looking for, do you know the concepts? Can you apply these values where they're meant to be and what you're doing with them? So I'm going to scroll down here to some of the incorrect ways to solve this, or some of the incomplete solutions. This is common for what I might see on an exam as I'm grading. And this particular example shows actually a final value of 8%. And if you're not familiar with this topic exactly, the maximum value was 6%, and this was stated in the problem statement. So yeah, immediately this is a pretty unreasonable value to provide. And it really is going to jump out to the professor immediately that you probably didn't understand the process to work. There's also just not enough information. The drawing is incomplete. There is a drawing, which is good, and it may just been a time issue for this particular respondent, but clearly there's not enough here to give much partial credit, and the answer is not really reasonable. It's really an unreasonable response. And that's something that going into the question itself, you should have some estimate. You should have some, well, the maximum of 6% and the minimum is going to be 0%. So it needs to be within that range of 0 to 6%. Anything above 6% is not reasonable. So that's something to think about as well, making sure your answer is reasonable and appropriate. Here's another example. This was not completed. And really this example is kind of walk through restating things that were provided in the problem. That's a good way to start, but don't use up too much time doing that. It's going to get you some points usually, but there hasn't been much work done here. There have been a couple of things that were done, a couple of calculations made, but the rest of this is just restating things that were provided in the problem statement. So a good start, but not completing it. And then here's the actual solution. So this shows some initial calculations. It's got a drawing. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not very good at drawing, but I'm gonna have something basic in there that I can look for. And it does ask for the cross slope of the road at a particular location. And that has both an inside lane component and an outside lane component. So I'm actually gonna box those answers. I'm gonna actually even relate those answers to the location they are on the drawing. That helps tie everything together. And then a final diagram just showing both of these answers drawn together. Another thing to think about when you're looking at an exam and prepping for an exam, old exams can be helpful, but they also in some ways can be misleading. The professor is likely not going to ask the same exact thing they've done in the past. But what I encourage you to look for on all exams, how are the questions asked? What were they looking for? Is it laid out in a way that you can replicate that or know how you're going to take the given information and solve for it? So again, I hope this review has been helpful and things to think about when you're working on an exam.